right. Hi, everybody. It's amazing to be with you live in person, to be with my friends from Antwerp and from Norway and all of you, especially after barely leaving my little home office in Montreal for the past 2 years. So it feels good to be here. But more than that, it feels important to be here with you at this moment in history that's so filled with peril and possibility, right? If we don't take this time to come together and reflect as we are about what we've learned from this pandemic, we've already seen how strong the pull is to go back to the way things were, or worse, to devolve to something more divided, more precarious, more catastrophic. So this feels like a decision point, doesn't it? I arrived this morning from Paris, and that's relevant to what I want to share with you today, because the things that I've learned from the pandemic had their first spark in Paris 20 years ago. It was 2001, and my husband was transferred to Paris temporarily for about 2 years with his job, and as you can imagine, I was happy to go with him. But I didn't have a work permit. I wasn't allowed to work there, and so I had a very different kind of pause, not pandemic-induced, but Paris-induced. And I decided to use that time to do intensive independent research. I wanted to understand what's at the root of every major problem in the world, and what more might be possible. You know, just a small question. So we lived across the street from the Rodin Museum, and I would spend my days in the lovely gardens of the museum. It was me and the thinker, you know, Rodin's most famous sculpture. And what he and I noticed was that at the root of every major problem in the world is a worldview, a dominant guiding story that tells us everything in the world operates like a machine, especially our organizations. It tells us that we can control and predict everything by breaking it down into its smallest parts. It tells us that we are separate from each other, separate from nature, separate from our organizations. It tells us that we exist to compete and consume, and I brought this because I knew I would need it. And it tells us that the only thing that really matters in life is productivity and profitability. You recognize that story? It's a story of domination and extraction, of colonization and patriarchy and white supremacy, and it's so all-pervasive that most of the time we don't even realize that it's just a story, and that other stories are available. In fact, in my research those 20 years ago, I noticed that there was another story emerging at the edges of society. And in many ways, it's a story that indigenous cultures have always held. It's a story that tells us that we're in harmony with life, and that our organizations aren't machines. They're dynamic, living systems, living ecosystems, and that the purpose of coming together in organization is not just productivity and profitability, it's enabling life to thrive, all life, in what I came to think of as the practice of thriveability. There it is. I think that's where Deepak was going, with the middle ground, you know? It's more than that, though. So what I found in my research into thriveability is that there are 4 basic fertile conditions that have to be cultivated for any living system to thrive, including our organizations. And I think of these as life's universal design principles. And I want to share those with you just briefly, because those design principles are also at the core of what I've learned during the pandemic. Okay, so just briefly, here's what we need to know. In every thriving living system, there are diverse parts that are supported and connected in patterns and structures of relationship and flow in a way that enables the emergence of a new level of life, a new whole, with capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic we're after, right? In living systems and in our organizations, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that new things become possible together, right? And what powers that magic, what enables that whole process to happen, is life. It's whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. Every thriving living system is inherently self-organizing, self-integrating, integrating parts into wholeness, self-generating, self-regenerating, because it is alive. And this is a huge departure from the mechanistic story that tells us we're driving the machine and controlling all those parts, right? And instead it tells us that we are more like gardeners or stewards of something precious and alive. So there I was in Paris, very excited about these discoveries. And somehow I convinced some business group to let me come and give a talk about what I was discovering. I don't even remember who they were now, but I remember I showed up and basically said, "Guys, it's about life." And they basically said, "Nah." In fact, they were French, so they probably said, "No." They couldn't understand what I was talking about. They couldn't really hear it. And I couldn't understand how they couldn't understand. And that was pretty much the story of my life for the next 10 years. I would point to things that I could see, and people would say, "Nah, don't see it, don't want it. I'm just looking out for myself, as the current story tells me I should." And I remember someone said to me, "Michelle, people aren't going to be able to hear what you're saying until they're in enough pain. Most people are too comfortable in the current system, current story." And I remember saying, "That can't be true. Who wouldn't want to move towards thriving? Who could be against aligning with life, right?" But I started to suspect that he might be right. So 10 years go by. And in 2011, I gave another TEDx on a stage just like this one. And it was the second most terrifying thing I've ever done. The first was when my son was born, with the umbilical cord around his neck, and he was blue. And happily, he turned out just fine. He's perfect. But only slightly less terrifying than that moment was giving this talk. And part of it is, public speaking is kind of scary, But part of it was standing in front of 500 people telling them something that they were likely to reject as irrelevant and wrong. So I was so nervous that at one point, I forgot what I wanted to say next. And I paused, and probably I took a drink of water too. So I paused. And in that moment, the audience burst into applause. And I thought, "Oh God, they think I'm finished." So I said, "Wait, hold on, there's more." And somehow I managed to finish the talk. But months later, I worked up the courage to watch the recording, and I realized that they had applauded because they liked what I had just said. And what I said was, if we don't make it our explicit intention to enable life to thrive, then we'll never get there. And they could hear that. And they liked it. And I thought, okay, maybe things are starting to shift. And another 10 years went by. But gradually, along the way, I gathered more and more pioneering, visionary clients who could hear that story and who were ready to work with life's universal design principles and who were open to bigger, bolder conversations like, what is it going to look like when each of us is able to bring our best gifts and contributions and to be nourished in the process as diverse parts? And what is it going to look like when we design our infrastructure in our organizations to support the flow of life? And what is it going to look like when we come together around such a compelling shared purpose that it responds to the call for healing and wholeness and wisdom that we sense in the world? And in all of that, what will it mean? What does it mean to us to be stewards or gardeners of something self-organizing and whole and precious and alive? In 2016, I published a book with stories of that work and the research that went into it. It's called The Age of Thriveability: Vital Perspectives and Practices for a Better World. And it was around that time that I started to notice this explosion of new language, new vocabulary and approaches in organizations, calls for organizations to be agile and regenerative and resilient, recognizing that we work within complexity. And none of these make sense within the mechanistic story. Machines are not capable of being agile or regenerative. Only something that's alive is. Right? All of these are living systems concepts. So again, I thought, maybe things are starting to shift. And now, here we are, 20 years after my days sitting in the gardens of the Rodin Museum. And this time, the whole world has paused. And despite all the tragedy and trauma that we've suffered, I've also seen that we've made more progress in the last 2 years than in the previous 20. We discovered that we're capable of coming together around common purpose and in collaborative action globally. We discovered that we're capable of rapid, dramatic change and of acting for the good of the whole and not only for ourselves. We learned to see each other more fully. The overlooked, stood in the spotlight, suddenly revealed as essential. We rediscovered nature's beauty and meaning. And finally, maybe the pain was enough to force us to see and hear the new story. Between wildfires and heat waves, floods, and unprecedented storms, we've been assaulted with evidence from scientific reports and our own lived experience that we can't continue as we have been. And we've also seen how strong and dangerous the pull of that mechanistic story is with its message of division and fear and hate. So in all of this, the result has been that the entire human population has had a crash course in living systems thinking, in the lessons of this new, more life-aligned worldview. For more of us than ever before, the pandemic broke down the facade of that mechanistic story of control and prediction and separation. More of us than ever before now understand that my actions affect your well-being and the well-being of our community and of the more than human community. And this isn't true for everyone, and there are certainly powerful forces pulling in the opposite direction. But for the first time ever, a critical mass of people everywhere is now able to see not only the parts, but the relationships and the emergent wholeness and the self-organization of life. And all the terrified TED Talks in the world couldn't have achieved that level of learning at that speed and at a global scale. So now, suddenly, it's almost mainstream to talk about regeneration and aligning with life's guiding principles, right? Now, suddenly, it seems to me that every third person on LinkedIn has regeneration in their profile. Now, suddenly, I have clients and projects around the world, and the conversation is dramatically different in the span of just 2 years. And just this morning, I arrived from Paris, where I was invited to give the opening keynote of a corporate conference about the future of enterprise. And they could hear it, and they liked it. So where do we go from here in this moment that is so filled with peril and possibility? I believe 4 things are needed, 4 actions. First, we need to come together around this story, this new worldview of alignment with life and of thriveability, with many names for it, many versions of it, but with absolute clarity that life is the true bottom line. And once we commit to that story, we start to see it everywhere. There's a saying that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, and I believe that's true. The second thing we need is practices for living into that new story together. And again, the practices are here and available. And most of all, what's needed are practices of stewardship, of aligning with life, of deepening in wisdom and compassion, and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. This is how I think of the practice of stewarding life. The third thing we need is to see and approach our organizations as practice grounds for a more thrivable world, so that whatever our activity, whatever our product or service, the core foundational purpose of coming together is to become better humans. It's to enable life to thrive, create the fertile conditions for life to be able to thrive. That's why we come together. And the fourth thing is storytelling, and many storytellers, so that we can make this emerging story of alignment with life more visible and more viral than the mechanistic story that is so effective at spreading its message of division and fear and hate. So where these four actions come together is a fertile space of possibility. It's a field of thrivability. And cultivating that field needs to become the central project of humanity, even more than technological solutions. Because if we don't tend to the thinking that guides our technological solutions, we risk building on shaky ground. We risk becoming ever more efficient at doing harm. So this is the decision point where we find ourselves. One second. Will we destroy ourselves within a story of domination and extraction and separation and control? Or will we move together into the age of thrivability? And what I've seen is that because of what we've learned during the pandemic, there is this critical mass of people who are now equipped more than ever before to move forward together in wise and courageous action. And that gives me hope. And just to be absolutely clear, this is really the end of my talk. So thank you so much. Thank you.